The casino lights gleamed like false promises in the hazy Vegas night, their neon brilliance casting a seductive glow over the bustling strip. Jack Carter sat hunched over a poker table in the center of the chaos, the weight of desperation etched into his rugged features. His shirt, once crisp and neatly tucked, hung loosely from his shoulders, a visual testament to the long night and longer years spent chasing the fleeting high of a big win. The hum of conversation and the rhythmic chime of slot machines buzzed around him. But Jack heard none of it. His world had shrunk to the felt-covered table before him, the stack of chips at his side dwindling with each hand. He stared at his cards, a poor hand that mirrored the state of his life, barely holding together and hopelessly outmatched. The dealer's voice cut through his thoughts. "Last bets, gentlemen." Jack's fingers hovered over his remaining chips, trembling slightly. He didn't need to glance at the gleaming tray across the room to know the truth. He was out of money. His credit cards were maxed out, his savings non-existent. Everything he'd worked for had already been sacrificed to the altar of chance. Everything except one thing. Jack hesitated, his gaze drifting to his left hand. The gold band encircling his finger felt heavier now than it ever had. It wasn't just a wedding ring, it was a promise, a reminder of the vows he had made to Emily, his wife, the one person who had stuck by him through all his mistakes. Not this, Jack whispered to himself, but the pull of the table was stronger than his conscience. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he slipped the ring off his finger, its absence leaving his hand feeling naked and hollow. He stuffed it into his pocket, avoiding the accusing stares of the other players. Gathering his coat, he headed for the exit, pushing through the glass doors into the cool night air. Across the street, the harsh glow of a pawnshop sign beckoned like a devil's grin. Jack stared at it, heart pounding, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Every rational voice in his head screamed at him to turn back, but desperation had long since drowned out reason. "This is the last time," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "One more bet, just one more." As he crossed the street, the ring felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket, a silent witness to his betrayal. Jack pushed open the door of the pawn shop, the sharp jingle of a bell cutting through the silence. The place smelled faintly of metal polish and old wood, with glass display cases housing everything from antique watches to gaudy costume jewelry. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set man with a scruffy beard and a tired expression, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in Jack's disheveled appearance. "What can I do for you?" the man asked, his voice gruff but laced with curiosity. Jack hesitated, fingers twitching in his pocket as he grasped the ring. His heart felt like it was pounding in his throat. I need some cash," he stammered. Slowly he pulled out the wedding band, its gold surface catching the dim overhead light. The pawnbroker raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking between the ring and Jack's face. "Wedding band, huh? Tough times." Jack avoided the question instead, sliding the ring across the glass counter. "What can you give me for it?" The man picked up the ring, turning it over in his thick fingers as he examined it. "Decent gold," he muttered, squinting at the engraving inside the band. "Forever, Emily." He let out a low whistle. "Sentimental piece, you sure you want to let this go?" Jack's jaw tightened. "How much?" he repeated, his voice hardening. The pawnbroker shrugged, setting the ring down on the counter. "I can give you 100, maybe 150 if I'm feeling generous." 100? Jack's voice cracked. "This is worth way more than that." "Not to me, it isn't," the man said bluntly. Sentimental value doesn't pay my bills, pal. Take it or leave it. Jack's hands curled into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to unclench them. His chest ached with shame as he nodded. Fine. 100. The transaction was over in moments, the man counting out crumpled bills and handing them to Jack with an air of indifference. As Jack stuffed the money into his wallet, the pawnbroker leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. You look like you've got a story, friend. Whatever you're chasing, I hope it's worth it. Jack didn't respond. He turned on his heel and left the shop, the doorbell ringing in his ears as he stepped back onto the street. The cash in his pocket felt like a hollow victory. The absence of the ring weighing heavier with each step he took back toward the casino. Back at the poker table, Jack's adrenaline surged as he laid his new stack of chips on the felt. The dealer shuffled the cards with mechanical precision, and the other players eyed Jack with quiet curiosity. He avoided their gazes, focusing instead on the cards in his hand. The first few hands went well. Jack played cautiously, watching the other players' movements and betting strategically. His pile of chips grew steadily, and for a brief moment, hope flickered in his chest. Maybe this was it. Maybe he could turn it all around. But hope, as Jack had learned, was a dangerous thing. The final hand came down to a showdown between Jack and a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable. The pot had ballooned to a staggering amount, and Jack's heart raced as he calculated the odds. He had a flush, strong, but not unbeatable. The man across from him pushed all his chips forward, his eyes boring into Jack's. "All in?" he said coolly. Jack hesitated, his mind spinning. If he won, he could leave the table with enough money to not only buy back the ring, but also pay off his debts, and maybe even surprise Emily with something special. If he lost? No, he couldn't think about that. "I'm in," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he shoved his chips into the center of the table. The dealer flipped the cards, and the world seemed to slow. Jack's flush glinted up at him from the felt, a beautiful, winning hand. But then his opponent revealed his cards, a full house. For a moment Jack didn't move. He couldn't. The reality of his loss sank in like a weight, pressing down on his chest and stealing the breath from his lungs. The chips, the money, the chance to fix everything. It was all gone. The walk home felt like a death march. Jack's mind was a whirlwind of guilt, fear, and self-loathing. The streets seemed darker, the lights dimmer, as if the city itself had turned its back on him. By the time he reached the small, cozy apartment he shared with Emily, he could barely bring himself to turn the key in the lock. The door creaked open, and Jack stepped inside, his shoulders slumped. The living room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the worn couch and coffee table. Emily sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. She looked up as Jack entered, her expression a mix of relief and quiet disappointment. "You're late," she said softly, her voice carrying none of the anger Jack had expected. "I was worried." Jack dropped his keys onto the counter, unable to meet her gaze. I screwed up, Em," he admitted, his voice breaking. I pawned the ring." Emily's eyes widened, and for a moment silence hung heavy between them. Then, to Jack's surprise, she reached into the pocket and pulled out the gold band, holding it up for him to see. "You mean this ring?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with emotion. Jack's breath caught in his throat. How did you—" "I noticed it was gone this morning," Emily said, setting the ring on the table. and I had a feeling I'd find it at the pawn shop down the street.
Jack sank into the chair across from her, his head in his hands. I'm so sorry, Emily. I don't even know what to say. Emily reached out, placing her hand gently over his. You don't have to say anything, she said softly. But Jack, we can't keep living like this. Something has to change. Jack nodded, tears streaming down his face. I know, he choked out. I know, and I promise I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Emily squeezed his hand, her expression a mix of sadness and hope. Then let's start now, she said, together.
Jack looked up at her, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. Jack wiped his eyes, overwhelmed by a mix of shame and relief. Emily's calm demeanor, her choice to confront the problem with compassion rather than anger, was both a blessing and a challenge. It was easier to imagine facing her wrath and confronting the depths of his addiction, but here she was, extending her hand, not in forgiveness yet, but in a call to action. Where do we even start? Jack asked, his voice thick with emotion.
Emily leaned back in her chair, her eyes steady as she considered her response. First, I need you to understand something. This isn't about the money, Jack. It's not about the ring. It's about trust. Every time you gamble, you're not just risking our finances, you're risking us, our future. And I can't keep doing this if you're not willing to fight for yourself. Her words hit Jack harder than any poker loss ever could. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the wedding ring sitting on the table between them. I'll do whatever it takes. I mean it this time.
Emily studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she got up from her chair, opened a drawer, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She slid it across the table to him. What's this? Jack asked, picking it up. A flyer for a support group, she replied. Gamblers Anonymous. There's a meeting tomorrow night. You can go with me, or you can go alone, but you will go.
Jack hesitated, the flyer feeling heavier than it should. He scanned the details on the page, the reality of what he needed to do sinking in. He'd always convinced himself he didn't need help, that he could stop gambling on his own. But the truth was, he'd said that so many times before, and here he was, staring at the fallout of his addiction yet again. I'll go, he said quietly, with you. The next evening, Jack and Emily walked into the community center where the meeting was being held. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, and the room was set up with a simple circle of folding chairs. A handful of people were already seated, their expressions a mix of weariness and hope. Jack felt exposed, like the weight of his mistakes was written all over his face.
A man in his 40s with kind eyes and a warm smile approached them. First time? He asked. Jack nodded. Yeah. Welcome, the man said, offering his hand. I'm Rob. We're glad you're here. The meeting began, and Jack listened as others shared their stories. Each one felt like a mirror reflecting pieces of his own life, reckless bets, lost savings, strained relationships. For the first time, he didn't feel alone in his struggle. When it was his turn to speak, his voice shook, but Emily's reassuring hand on his arm gave him the courage to begin. My name's Jack, he started, his gaze darting around the circle. And I'm a gambler. I've lost a lot because of it. Money, trust, myself. I thought I could fix it on my own, but I was wrong. I'm here because I don't want to lose the one thing I have left, my wife. As the group murmured their support, Jack felt a flicker of hope. Admitting his problem out loud was terrifying, but it also felt like the first real step toward change. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of Jack's life. He attended meetings regularly, worked with a sponsor, and began tracking his finances meticulously to avoid slipping back into old habits. Emily supported him, but she was also clear about her boundaries. She insisted on transparency, keeping a close eye on their accounts and asking tough questions when needed. At first, Jack resented the constant scrutiny. It felt like a spotlight on his failures, but over time, he began to see it differently. Emily's vigilance wasn't about punishing him. It was about protecting the life they were rebuilding together. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Emily turned to Jack and said, "You know, I'm proud of you." Jack blinked, caught off guard. "For what?"
"For sticking with this," she said. "I know it's not easy, but I can see how hard you're trying, and it means a lot." Her words filled Jack with a quiet determination. He wasn't just doing this for himself, he was doing it for her, for them. Months later, Jack walked into the same pawn shop where he'd sold his wedding ring. The same grizzled pawnbroker stood behind the counter, his expression neutral as Jack approached. "Back again?" the man asked.
"Not for the reason you think," Jack replied, pulling a small velvet pouch from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a gold necklace, simple but elegant. "I want to buy this for my wife. It's a thank you for everything she's done for me." The pawnbroker raised an eyebrow. "You're not pawning it after, are you?" Jack shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Not a chance." As Jack left the shop, necklace in hand, he felt a surge of pride. It wasn't just about the gift, it was about what it represented. For the first time in years, he was making choices that built their future instead of tearing it apart.
On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jack surprised Emily with a quiet ceremony in their backyard. Surrounded by a handful of close friends and family, they stood under a string of fairy lights, their hands clasped together.
"I've made a lot of mistakes," Jack said, his voice steady as he looked into Emily's eyes. "But the one thing I'll never regret is marrying you. You've stood by me when I didn't deserve it, and I promise to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to doubt me again."
Tears shimmered in Emily's eyes as she smiled. "I believe in you, Jack," she said, "and I always will."
As Jack slid the familiar gold ring onto Emily's finger, the weight of his journey hit him. It wasn't just a symbol of their love, it was a testament to their resilience, their ability to weather life's storms and come out stronger on the other side. Over time, Jack's life began to transform. He found a new job, one that allowed him to focus on rebuilding their finances while also giving back to the community. He became a mentor at Gamblers Anonymous, sharing his story with others who were struggling. Emily, too, found new purpose, volunteering at local support groups to help families affected by addiction. Their life wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real, honest, and grounded in the hard-won lessons they had learned together. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set, Jack turned to Emily and said, "You know, I used to think gambling was the biggest risk I ever took, but it wasn't." Emily tilted her head, curious. "What was?" "Believing I could fix everything on my own," he said. "The real gamble was trusting you, trusting us to figure it out together. And that's a bet I'll never regret." Emily smiled, lacing her fingers with his. "Good," she said softly, "because that's the one bet you'll always win." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm golden glow, Jack felt something he hadn't in years. Peace,